Before we begin, here's a question to sit with. Have you ever watched someone publicly humiliate another person? Not out of anger, not out of a single moment of lost control, but deliberately, strategically, with an audience carefully chosen and a microphone in hand, and seen it backfire in a way that nobody in the room could have predicted? Drop your answer in the comments as you listen. Margaret Ashford had spent 43 years building a particular kind of life. The kind that was organized around appearances, around the right addresses and the right schools and the right connections and the right kind of people at the right kind of table. She had married into money and then, through the specific discipline of someone who understood that access was its own form of power, had built the social architecture of her family's position brick by careful brick. She had one son, and her son had married the wrong woman. Not wrong because she was unkind or disloyal or incompatible. Wrong, in Margaret's precise and ungenerous assessment, because she was not from the right kind of family, because her background was modest, or so Margaret believed, because she had appeared in their world without the specific markers of the life Margaret had spent 43 years constructing. On the evening of the Ashford family's annual estate dinner, 200 guests, the finest catering company in the county, a marquee on the lawn that had cost more than some people's annual salary, Margaret had decided that the time for private disapproval was over. She had a microphone in her hand. She had an audience of 200 people, and she had decided to say publicly what she had been saying privately for 2 years. What she had not factored into the evening was the black car that had turned through the estate gates at 8:47. She had not factored in the man who stepped out of it. She had not factored in who that man was. And she had not factored in that the daughter-in-law she had just humiliated in front of 200 people was about to be introduced to the room by the one person whose name would render everything Margaret had just said not only incorrect, but profoundly, publicly, irreversibly embarrassing. Her father. There is a specific kind of cruelty that arrives wearing the clothes of concern. It says things like, "I am only being honest," or "Someone needed to say it," or "I just want what is best for my son." And it delivers these things with a smile, in front of an audience, at the exact moment calculated to cause the most damage while providing the most plausible deniability. This is a story about that kind of cruelty. And about the specific, complete, irreversible consequence of deploying it against a woman whose value you had decided in advance, and therefore never bothered to investigate. It is also a story about a daughter who never announced herself. Not because she had nothing to announce, but because she had learned, from the man who raised her, that the people worth knowing do not need to be impressed, and the people who need to be impressed are rarely worth knowing. Her silence was not weakness. Her silence was patience. And on the evening of the Ashford estate dinner, her patience expired. If you have ever been dismissed by someone who had already decided what you were worth before they looked, this story is for you. Before we begin, one ask. If this story finds something true in you today, right? She never needed to announce herself in the comments. Let this family know you are here. Now, let us begin. Margaret Ashford had been born Margaret Elaine Prescott in a suburb of Boston, the daughter of a dentist father and a mother who had spent her entire adult life managing the specific social choreography of upper-middle-class life with the precision and dedication of someone who understood that in certain circles, reputation was currency, and currency required constant maintenance. She had married Charles Ashford at 26, a man from genuine old money, whose family had been in Connecticut real estate for 3 generations and whose name opened certain doors before he had spoken a word. She had been beautiful and socially fluent, and she had understood, with the clear-eyed pragmatism of someone who had been raised to see marriage as a strategic as well as a romantic institution, that Charles Ashford represented the specific consolidation of position that her mother had spent 20 years preparing her for. The marriage had been, by the metrics both families measured, successful. They had built a life of considerable comfort and social standing. The estate in Westport, the apartment in the city, the membership at 2 clubs, the annual dinner that had become, across 30 years, one of the more anticipated events in their social circle. 200 guests, late October, the estate draped in seasonal elegance, the kind of evening that communicated, to everyone attending, exactly how the Ashfords had spent their decades. Charles had died 6 years ago. Margaret had continued without him with the efficiency of someone who had always been the operational center of the life they shared, and who found, in widowhood, that the absence of her husband had changed the atmosphere of the estate without substantially altering its structure. She ran the annual dinner as she had always run it. She managed her social calendar as she had always managed it. And she directed her attention, the specific, organized, unrelenting attention of a woman who had nothing to do but maintain the architecture of what she had built, toward the problem that had arrived in her life 2 years ago in the form of her son's marriage. Her son, James Ashford, was 34 years old. He had his father's easy manner and his mother's organizational intelligence, and he had spent his 20s building a career in urban development finance that was genuinely accomplished on its own terms, not dependent on the family name, not propped up by Margaret's connections, but built through the specific quality of his own judgment and the relationships he had developed independently. He had met his wife at a professional conference in Atlanta 18 months before the wedding. He had called his mother 2 weeks after returning and said, "I have met someone." Margaret had said, "Tell me about her." He had told her, the name she did not recognize, the city she considered provisional, the professional role. She worked in nonprofit arts administration, registered in Margaret's specific social ledger as the occupation of someone who did not have better options. She had said the right things on the phone. She had begun managing her concerns privately. Simone Carter had come into the Ashford world the way she came into every room, without announcement, without the specific markers of status that Margaret had spent a lifetime reading, and with a quality of composed self-possession that Margaret had interpreted, from the very beginning, as evidence of someone who did not know how to perform in the way the world she was entering required. She was 32 years old. She had grown up in Atlanta, the daughter of a man she had not spoken of in detail to the Ashfords. Her mother had raised her. Her father had been largely absent from her daily life. She had attended a state university. She had worked her way into the nonprofit arts sector through genuine passion and considerable organizational talent. She was warm and intelligent and funny in the specific way of someone who is entirely comfortable in their own skin. She was also, to Margaret's trained eye, not from money. She did not carry herself in the specific way of women who had grown up with it. She did not have the particular ease around certain objects and spaces that old money produced. She wore beautiful clothes, but not the right labels. She was gracious at dinner, but did not have the specific fluency with certain social rituals that Margaret had learned to read as signals. Margaret had decided, within 3 months of meeting her son's girlfriend, that Simone Carter was not what the Ashford family required. She had said so, privately, to James. He had said, "I love her, and I am going to marry her." She had said, "I simply want you to be certain." He had said, "I am certain." The engagement had been announced. The wedding had been planned. Margaret had attended both with the composed, gracious performance of a woman who had decided that open opposition was less effective than patient, persistent, low-grade disapproval. She had been patient. She had been persistent. She had maintained the low-grade disapproval across 14 months of engagement and 8 months of marriage with the specific efficiency of a woman who had spent 43 years understanding that the most damaging campaigns were the ones conducted quietly. And then something had shifted. Some accumulation of small slights and perceived condescensions, and the specific, nagging awareness that Simone Carter did not defer to her the way she expected, did not perform gratitude for inclusion in the family the way she expected, did not seem to understand or acknowledge the weight of what she had been given by marrying into the Ashford name, had shifted Margaret's approach from patient and private to something else entirely. To the evening of the annual dinner, to the microphone, to the 200 guests. The 2 years of the marriage had not been overtly dramatic. Margaret had not made scenes. She had not delivered ultimatums. She had not done any of the things that would have given James clear and specific cause to draw a line. She had done something more difficult to name and more difficult to defend against. She had created an atmosphere. At family dinners, she directed the conversation toward topics she knew Simone was less fluent in: European travel, private school education, the specific social geography of the Ashford social circle, and then responded to Simone's contributions with the particular warmth of someone who found a child's earnest attempt charming without taking it seriously. She asked Simone about her work with the specific tone of someone making polite conversation with a person employed in an interesting but marginal field. She praised James's choices, his apartment before they moved in together, his investment decisions, his professional connections, in ways that quietly implied that the quality of those choices predated his marriage. She also said small things, said quickly, in passing, in the specific register of someone who was simply observing rather than criticizing. She said things like, "Simone is so adaptable, isn't she, for someone from her background?" And, "I admire how James has helped her find her footing in a world that must be quite different from what she grew up with." And, once, at a family Sunday lunch, with 7 people at the table, "We were all a little worried at first, given that we knew so little about where she came from. But she has been quite an asset to James socially, I think." Simone had sat at that table and absorbed every one of those sentences with a composure that Margaret had read as confirmation of her power over the situation. It had not been that. It had been something considerably more patient. James had noticed. He had spoken to his mother after the Sunday lunch. He had said, "I need you to stop saying things like that about Simone." Margaret had said, "I have only ever said kind things about Simone." He had said, "I mean the things that sound kind but are not." She had said, "I am not sure I know what you mean." He had said, "Yes, you do." Margaret had said, "James, I love you, and I only want what is best for your family. If I have said anything that was misinterpreted, I am very sorry for that." James had looked at his mother with the expression of a man who had grown up watching her conduct these conversations and who understood that the conversation he was in was not going to produce what he needed it to produce. He had gone home. He had told Simone. Simone had said, "I know." He had said, "I am sorry." She had said, "It is not yours to apologize for." She said it without bitterness. Just as a fact, "I know exactly who I am. Your mother's opinion of me does not change that." James had looked at his wife. He had said, "You are extraordinary. I want you to know I see that." She had said, "I know you do. That is what matters." She had meant it. The annual Ashford Estate dinner had been held on the last Saturday of October for 30 years. 200 guests. The marquee on the West Lawn. Catering from the firm that had served the Ashfords for a decade. A string quartet for the first hour, a band for the second. The kind of event that had its own momentum. Guests who had attended for years knew where to go and how it worked and what it meant to be there. Simone had attended twice before this evening. She had navigated both previous dinners with the same warm, composed efficiency she brought to everything. Present, gracious, genuinely engaged with the people she talked to, entirely unwilling to perform insecurity for an audience that she suspected would have enjoyed it. On this third occasion, James had been delayed. A development finance deal he had been closing for 6 weeks had required an emergency call at 6 in the evening that had pushed his arrival back by 90 minutes. He had called Simone, who was already dressed, and told her he would be there as close to 8 as he could manage, that she should go ahead, that he was sorry. She had gone ahead. She had arrived at the estate at 7:30, greeted the guests she knew, introduced herself to the ones she did not, and moved through the evening with the specific self-sufficiency of a woman who did not require her husband present to know how to occupy a room. Margaret had watched this, and Margaret had decided that the specific self-sufficiency, in James's absence, was an opportunity. At 8:15, Margaret took the microphone. This was not unusual. She always said a few words at the annual dinner, welcoming remarks, a toast to the family, a reflection on the year. It was expected. It was part of how the evening worked. She said the welcoming remarks. She gave the toast. And then, in the specific seamless continuation of someone who had planned this moment, she pivoted. She said, "I want to take a moment to speak about family, about what it means, about the standards we hold and the reasons we hold them." The 200 guests gave her their attention. She said, "When James told us he was going to be married, we were naturally eager to understand who he had chosen. We want the best for our son. We always have. And I think anyone in this room who is a parent understands that instinct, the desire to ensure your child has chosen well." She paused. She said, "I will be honest with you all tonight. When we learned about Simone's background, about the modest circumstances she came from, about the fact that she did not come from the kind of family that would be familiar to most of the people in this room, there were questions. There were concerns. There are always concerns when someone arrives in a family with a different, she paused again, precisely, different foundation. The room had gone quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when they understand that something uncomfortable is happening. She said, I share this tonight not to be unkind. I share it because I believe in honesty among people who know each other well. And I think it is important to acknowledge, openly, that the adjustments required when someone from, she chose the word carefully, from more limited origins joins a family like ours are significant ones. For everyone. She looked across the marquee to where Simone was standing. She smiled. She said, and I think Simone has made admirable efforts. Truly. For someone from her background. The marquee was very still. Simone stood where she was, in the specific composed stillness that had been her answer to Margaret Ashford for 2 years. Her expression did not break. It did not break because she had decided, a long time ago, that the people in this room seeing her react to Margaret's cruelty was not something Margaret was going to get from her. Not tonight. Not in front of anyone. And then, at the entrance to the marquee, a man appeared. He had arrived in a black car at 8:47. He was 64 years old. He wore a dark suit, not a tuxedo, not the formal attire of someone who had dressed for an estate dinner, but the specific, authoritative dark suit of a man who dressed for himself rather than for occasions. His hair was silver. His bearing was the bearing of someone who had spent a great deal of his life being the most significant person in rooms considerably more significant than this one. He stood at the entrance for a moment. His eyes found his daughter across the marquee. Something moved across his expression, not anger, not immediately, something more controlled. The expression of a man who has walked into a room and understood, very quickly, what has happened in it. He walked across the marquee. He walked with the unhurried purpose of someone who understood that he was the most powerful person in this space, and who did not need to announce this fact through his pace. He reached his daughter. He said, Simone. She looked at him. She said, Dad, you came. He said, I told you I would. He put his hand on her arm briefly, a specific, private gesture of solidarity that was not performed for the room, but that the room watched anyway. Then he looked toward the woman with the microphone. Have you ever watched someone walk into a room and change the entire power structure of it simply by being who they were? And felt something shift in your own chest when it happened? James arrived at 8:52. He came through the marquee entrance slightly out of breath, his jacket slightly disheveled from the car, the look of a man who had driven faster than was entirely sensible to get here. He saw his wife first. He saw the man beside her second. His expression shifted from relief to something more complicated. The specific expression of a son who has arrived to find the situation considerably more developed than he had anticipated. He crossed the marquee. He said, Simone. And then, Sir. The man looked at him with the evaluating attention of a father who had opinions about the son-in-law he was reserving until a more appropriate moment. He said, James. It was one word, and it contained a complete assessment. James said, I am sorry I was late. I came as quickly as I could. The man said, I know. Simone told me about the deal. A guest who had been standing nearby. A man named Richard, one of the Ashford family's oldest friends, who had attended this dinner for 20 years and who had the specific advantage of having spent a great deal of time in international financial circles, had been looking at Simone's father since the moment he walked in. His expression was the expression of someone whose memory was catching up to a face. He said, Excuse me. I am sorry, but are you? He stopped. Are you Walter Carter? The man turned to look at him. He said, I am. Richard said, Walter Carter of Carter Capital. He said, Yes. Richard looked at the marquee around him with the expression of someone recalibrating the entire evening in real time. He said, I apologize. I did not realize Simone was your daughter. Walter Carter said, She generally prefers to be known on her own terms. He said it without edge, simply as a statement of his daughter's character. The name Walter Carter did not mean the same thing to all 200 people in that marquee. To those who moved in certain financial and philanthropic circles, it meant something specific and significant. Walter Carter had founded Carter Capital 31 years ago. He had built it from a regional wealth management operation into one of the most respected private equity and philanthropic investment firms in the country. His foundations giving in education, healthcare, and community development had been recognized at the federal level. His name appeared on buildings at 3 universities. He was, by any measurement that the Ashford family's world understood, considerably more significant than the Ashford family. This information moved through the 200 guests in the marquee with the specific speed that significant information moves through rooms of people who understand its implications, first in whispers, then in the particular stillness of collective realization. Margaret Ashford stood with the microphone still in her hand. She had heard the name. She knew the name. She had simply, catastrophically, not connected it to the woman standing at the front of her marquee who had been married to her son for 8 months. She looked at Walter Carter. She looked at Simone. She looked at the 200 guests who were, with varying degrees of subtlety, looking at her. She said nothing. There was nothing available to her to say. Walter Carter looked toward Margaret for the first time. He said, "I believe we have not been formally introduced. I am Simone's father," Margaret said, with the specific, careful composure of someone assembling dignity from whatever remained available. "Mr. Carter. What a pleasure. We had no idea you would be joining us this evening." Walter said, "I understand." He paused. "I had planned to arrive earlier, but my flight from London was delayed. I was sorry to have missed the earlier part of the evening." The implication that he had been in London that morning landed in the room quietly. He said, "I did, however, arrive in time to hear the remarks from the microphone." The marquee was entirely still. He said, "I want to be careful about how I say what I am going to say, because I understand that this is your home and your family and your event, and I respect that." He looked at Margaret with the specific, measured composure of a man who had spent 31 years in rooms where everything he said mattered and who had therefore learned to say things precisely. He said, "My daughter has never come from modest circumstances. She was raised in a home where the emphasis was on character, education, and service rather than the display of wealth, because I have always believed, and still believe, that those things matter more. She attended the school she attended because she chose them, not because we could not afford others. She works in nonprofit arts administration because she believes in what it does, not because better options were unavailable to her." He said, "I share this not to embarrass you. I share it because I heard my daughter's origins described as limited in front of 200 people, and I think the record deserves to be corrected." He paused. He said, "Simone has never told James or his family about Carter Capital or about our family's resources because she wanted to be chosen for who she is rather than for what her father built. That is a decision I respect completely. It is also a decision that, as of this evening, has produced the specific result of making her value visible to a room full of people who had already decided what she was worth without investigating." He looked at the room. He said, "I hope the rest of the evening is a good one." He turned back to his daughter. James stood beside his wife and his father-in-law in a marquee that had the specific electric silence of 200 people simultaneously processing something extraordinary. He said, "Simone, I am so sorry. I should have been here." She said, "You are here now." He said, "I should have been here before it happened." She looked at him. She said, "James, I have been handling your mother for 2 years. Tonight was the same as every other night except that more people were watching." He said, "It was not the same." She said, "No, it was not." She was quieter in the pause that followed. "But I am all right. I promise you I am all right." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "We need to talk. Not tonight, but soon." She said, "Yes, we do." Walter Carter stood slightly apart, speaking quietly with Richard and 2 other guests who had gravitated toward him with the specific, warm energy of people encountering someone they admired in an unexpected context. He was not performing anything. He was simply the man he had always been, warm, direct, genuinely interested in the people he was speaking to. This, Simone had grown up understanding, was the thing about her father that certain people never understood until they were in the room with him. His significance was not in his name or his capital. It was in his specific, unhurried way of treating every person in front of him as someone worth his full attention. She had learned this from him. It was why she had not needed Margaret Ashford to validate her. It was why she had never needed to announce herself. Margaret Ashford had retreated from the center of the marquee. She stood at the edge of a conversation near the back, composed in the practiced way of someone who had been managing social situations for 43 years and who was now deploying every technique available to her to manage this one. It was not working with the usual efficiency, because the specific damage of what had happened was not the kind that could be managed in the room where it happened. The 200 guests at the Ashford Estate dinner would remember this evening for a long time. Not as the annual dinner. As the evening when Margaret Ashford called her daughter-in-law poor in front of 200 people, and the daughter-in-law's father turned out to be Walter Carter. The story would circulate with the particular speed of something that was too specific and too extraordinary to lose anything in the retelling. Margaret understood this. She stood at the edge of the marquee, and she understood it completely. James found her later in the evening. He said, "I need to speak with you." They had the conversation in the house, away from the marquee, in the sitting room that had been his father's favorite room and which had always been the place where the Ashford family's difficult conversations happened. He said, "What you said tonight was wrong. Not misguided. Not poorly timed. Wrong. And I need you to understand that what I say next is not negotiable." Margaret said, "James." He said, "You have been doing this for 2 years. Smaller versions of it, in rooms with fewer people. Tonight you did it with a microphone in front of 200 guests at your own dinner. And what happened is that you humiliated yourself in front of every person you care about impressing, and you humiliated my wife, and you did it on information that was not accurate." Margaret said, "I did not know." He said, "That is the point. You did not know because you never asked. You looked at Simone and decided what she was worth, and you never once investigated whether you were right." He stopped. "I am not asking you to apologize because I think an apology will fix this. I am telling you that the way you treat my wife going forward is going to determine how much of me you have in your life." Margaret looked at her son. She said, "James, I was only." He said, "I know what you were only doing, Mom. I have always known." She paused. "I am done pretending I do not." He stood. He went back to the marquee. He went back to his wife. Simone and her father sat together in the car on the way to the hotel after the dinner had ended. She said, "You did not have to do that." He said, "I know." She said, "I had it handled." He said, "I know that too." He looked at her with the quiet warmth of someone who has been watching his daughter handle things her entire life. "I did not come to rescue you," she said. "Then why?" He said, "Because she said it in front of 200 people. And your father was available and willing and there." She looked out the car window at the Connecticut October night. She said, "I never wanted them to know. About Carter Capital. About any of it." He said, "I know. And I understand why. And I want you to know that I believe that decision was correct. You were right to want to be chosen for yourself." She said, "James chose me." He said, "Yes, he did." And watching him come through that marquee entrance tonight, she paused. He looked like a man who understood what he had. She said, "He has always understood. That is not the problem." He said, "I know what the problem is." She said, "She is never going to change." Her father was quiet for a moment. He said, "Some people do not. But they can learn that the cost of not changing is higher than they initially calculated." She said, "You think tonight changed the calculation?" He said, "I think tonight changed the calculation in front of 200 people." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "She is going to be embarrassed for a very long time." He said, "Yes." She said, "I almost feel sorry for her." He looked at her. She said, "Almost." They were both quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother would have been proud of you tonight." She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was steady. She said, "I know. I thought about her in that marquee. Standing there while Margaret said those things. I thought, she would have been furious on my behalf. And I thought, she also would have told me that the woman with the microphone does not know who she is talking to." She paused. She said, "So I just stood there and waited. Because the truth was going to arrive eventually." Her father said, "It arrived at 8:47. She said, "It did." They drove through the Connecticut night toward the hotel. Margaret Ashford spent 43 years building a world organized around appearances. She built it carefully, and she maintained it obsessively, and she defended it with the specific, unrelenting energy of someone who understood that the world she had constructed was the only version of power she had access to. And then, on the last Saturday of October, she stood in her own marquee with a microphone in her hand and 200 guests watching, and she said the specific wrong thing about the specific wrong woman. She called Simone Carter poor. She described her origins as limited. She implied, in front of everyone whose opinion she valued, that her son had married beneath him. She was wrong. Not morally wrong, though she was that too. Factually wrong. The woman she had spent 2 years managing and dismissing and carefully, strategically, publicly diminishing was the daughter of Walter Carter, the man who had built one of the most respected investment and philanthropic operations in the country, whose name was on buildings at 3 universities, whose daughter had chosen to be known on her own terms. Simone had never announced herself. She had never needed to. She had stood in Margaret Ashford's world for 2 years and been warmer and more patient and more composed than the world deserved from her, not because she did not know her worth, but because she had learned from the man who raised her that worth does not require an audience. It simply is. And on the last Saturday of October, at 8:47, her father walked through a marquee entrance, and the room learned what she had always known. She was never poor. She was never limited. She was never what Margaret needed her to be. She was exactly who she had always been. She simply never needed 200 people to know it. Until the night it mattered. Final question for you. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who had already decided your value? And what would it have looked like to let the room discover the truth on its own terms, in its own time? Leave your answer below. Your voice belongs in this conversation. If this story found something real in you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. One share. It costs nothing and means everything. I love you all. I will see you in the next story.